Thank you so much for joining us for our Meet VC authors. My name is Christina Stanchin. I'm a professor of English here, and I direct the Humanities Research Center. We have quite a few events this year, this fall, this month. And if you'd like to learn more about those, I'm going to ask Hillary, who is our assistant director, to post a link for us in the chat. We have two more events this week, including busy week, I know, after a wonderful Humanities Week last week. Thank you so much to all of you who made time to attend and participate. We have two more events this week, including a curriculum conversations event on Wednesday at 4 o'clock in STEM building. We'll be welcoming Julio Camarota from the University of Arizona, who will be talking about what we can learn from Arizona's ethnic studies ban about Latina education. So this is on Wednesday. And then on Thursday afternoon, we've been working really hard on this event, which is a conversation about contemporary Native art in Virginia between Becky Hill, who is a Pamunkey citizen, and the head of the VNAA, which is the Virginia Native Artists Alliance, and Sierra Height, who is Cherokee and the curator of Native art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The panel on Thursday at 4 p.m. in the Cabell Library is called Our Land, Our Art. And we also hope to have a slide of Virginia Native artists start on the big library screen starting November 1st. So we look forward to starting that as well. We also have a pretty extensive newsletter. We would like for you to sign up if you're not already signed up at the address in the chat. Thank you so much for posting that, Hillary or Ellie. A word on the series. I know many of you are regulars, so I will not belabor the description. This is really a highlight of the week for me, and we keep using the webinar format because it works. We can also record these events and publicize the books and the events widely. It's really an opportunity for us to learn about what our colleagues are working on and to let them shine. Books take many, many years to finish sometimes, and we often welcome colleagues from other countries, other continents. Our virtual event today will follow more or less a similar format. I'll introduce our guests first, and they will take about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll field the questions in the order in which we receive them. You can use both the chat function and the Q&A. If you're not from Richmond, would you mind signing in the chat and letting us know where you're hailing from? Thank you so much. With us today are Dr. Jenny Rhee, our colleague here at VCU, as well as Dr. I'm sorry, Melody, should have asked how to pronounce your name. Melody Jouet?
Close, Melody Jew.
Melody Jew. Okay, thank you so much, and I apologize for that. Melody Jew and Professor Melody Jew and Professor Zach Blass. I will start by introducing Jenny briefly, who for our audiences really doesn't need an introduction. But for those of you who don't know Dr. Rhee, she's an associate professor in the Department of English here at VCU. In her research, she analyzes artificial intelligence and robotics technologies in relation to race, gender, and labor in books such as Robotic Imaginary, the human and the price of dehumanized labor. We had Wendy Chan recently who gave a talk at VCU, and we saw Jenny's wonderful book cover on one of the screens. So Jenny, just to give you a heads up, she's also the editor of the Palgrave Handbook of 20th and 21st century literature and science, as well as many chapters and a special issue of a journal we learned of American Literature Journal, which we've already heard from just a few months ago. She examines the different visions of humanness that shape AI technologies and bring these technologies into conversation with theorizations of AI in speculative fiction as well as art. Her scholarship and teaching are in the areas of speculative fiction studies, literature and science, feminist science and technology studies, critical AI studies, and eco-critical media studies. Here at VCU, she directs the MA program and regularly teaches courses for the major as well as graduate courses in the English and MATX programs. Dr. Melody Ju is a professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who works across the fields of ocean humanities, science fiction, science studies, and media theory. She's the author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, published by Duke in 2020, which won the 2020 Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science Book Award. Congratulations. She's also the co-editor with Rafiko Ruiz of Saturation, also published by Duke in 2021. Professor Ju has published articles in journals including Grey Room Configurations, Women's Studies Quarterly, Resilience, and Media and Environment. Her new work explores the mediations of seaweeds in transpacific contexts. What a wonderful topic. Thanks for being here. And last but not least, and he is here after experiencing some technical difficulties, he's here with us. Dr. Zach Blass is an artist, filmmaker, and writer whose practice spans moving image, computation theory, performance, and science fiction. He engages the materiality of digital technologies while also drawing out the philosophies and imaginaries lurking in artificial intelligence, biometric recognition, predictive policing, airport security, and the internet and biological warfare. The Doors from 2019 is an immersive environment that imagines a new psychedelic age fueled by AI, nootropics, and tech culture. Sanctum from 2018 is a sex dungeon cum detention center, interesting, that recasts security and surveillance through BDSM. A film installation, Contra Internet, Jubilee 2033 from 2018, follows author Ayn Rand on an acid trip. Can it be a different type of trip? On an acid trip in which she bears witness to dystopian future of the internet. I'm Here to Learn, So, from 2017, a 4-channel video installation in collaboration with Jemima Wyman, resurrects Microsoft AI Tay to consider the gender politics of pattern recognition and machine learning. Facial weaponization suit, developed between 2018 and 14, consists of amorphous masks that demand opacity against biometric facial recognition systems. Quite a treat for us today. Welcome, Dr. Reed, Dr. Ju, and Dr. Blass. Congratulations on your recent book, and welcome to Meet VC Authors.
Thank you, Dr. Stanchu, for that wonderful introduction and for introducing us to share our book with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me one moment to set that up. Okay, so Informatics of Domination is an experimental collection that addresses formations of power that manifest through the pairing of contemporary technical systems and white capitalist patriarchy. Because this is an experimental project, our remarks today are going to focus on the more theoretical and formal aspects of the project. Our collection was inspired by a lecture series organized by Zach at Goldsmiths in 2017. This lecture series was titled Informatics of Domination, and the program considered computational surveillance and digital control from the perspectives of artists, academics, and curators. Zach then invited Melody and me to expand on this work in what is now our edited collection. And Zach will talk more about the genesis of the project in a moment. As editors, we've brought a range of interdisciplinary perspectives to the collection. Zach is an artist, filmmaker, and writer who dwells in digital technologies, materialities, imaginaries, and philosophies. Melody is a scholar who works across the ocean humanities, science fiction, science studies, and media theory. And I'm a scholar of feminist science and technology studies, contemporary art, literature, science, and critical AI. We started this project in 2019, so our editorial collaboration spanned many years, multiple higher ed multiple higher education labor actions, a global pandemic, and countless meetings over Skype and then over Zoom once Skype shut down. The informatics of domination is a concept that appears in Donna Haraway's classic essay, A Manifesto for Cyborgs. As many of you may know, Haraway is an important scholar of feminist science studies, and her work has shaped and influenced numerous fields for decades. While Haraway's essay is best known for its theorization of the figure of the cyborg, our volume focuses on the informatics of domination, which is a concept that has received less attention, but that we argue is perhaps a more enduring concept and form for understanding our contemporary moment. Haraway's essay contains a section titled The Informatics of Domination. In this section, Haraway narrates a wide-ranging transition in the operations of power, marking a shift from industrial capitalism to information capitalism beginning in the second half of the 20th century. Immediately following this narrative paragraph, immediately after that colon that you see here, is a two-column 32-row chart that maps modes of power and domination. Haraway calls this the chart of transitions. Haraway doesn't really define the informatics of domination in the paragraph that we just saw. Instead, she uses this chart to introduce and examine the informatics of domination. In other words, the informatics of domination concept is most robustly and thoroughly theorized by Haraway through this chart. 40 years later, Melody, Zach, and I took this as an invitation to engage in a diagrammatic analysis of the chart in order to more fully understand the informatics of domination as a concept, as a nexus of modes of power, and as a way of understanding our contemporary techno-political moment. Based on our analysis of the chart, we define the informatics of domination as a concept that names and situates domination and power in all their multivectoral complexities, including the oppressive, the resistant, defiant, and the subversive. The informatics of domination is a form of power shaped but not totalized by white capitalist patriarchy as it manifests through information systems, networks, and computers in the 21st century. The informatics of domination is a medium-specific analysis of domination's myriad modalities. The informatics of domination is also a diagrammatic form that is at once unfinished and inviting in its capacity to imagine, apprehend, and bring forward intersectional feminist and queer futures. I'll talk more about our analysis of the chart as a future-oriented technological form shortly, but first I wanted to give you an overview of the volume and some insights into our editorial process. As editors, we spend a lot of time analyzing and interpreting the chart, take seriously the chart's commitment to transitions, change, and possibility. Remember, the chart is described as the chart of transitions. This chart's diagrammatic theorization of domination and power is the conceptual inspiration for our collection. We also take the chart as the organizing structure and experimental form for our volume by using the chart as a table of contents to generate a series of new writings. We see the chart first and foremost as an invitation to think, interpret, theorize, and world build, and we extended this invitation to our 50 contributors who are artists, scholars, curators, and creative writers. And here's a glimpse of the organizational chart that we use to keep track of this sprawling project. This spreadsheet is thanks to Zach's stellar organizational and project management skills, which I was so grateful for throughout the project. Zach will be giving an artist talk here at VCU in March, so please, everybody be sure to come to that event to hear more about Zach's artworks. So here's the text of our original invitation, which we sent out to contributors in 2019. The invitation, the excerpt from the invitation reads, "The edited collection will focus entirely on this chart from Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. At the moment of Haraway's writing in the 1980s, the two columns marked a shift from an older historical moment to a newer periodization that Haraway named the informatics of domination. We invite you to consider what the chart helps us to see today and whether or not the contemporary moment exceeds the bounds of the original chart. Across 32 entries, we're inviting artists, historians, theorists, art critics, and creative writers to engage with a single entry in the chart by either 1, considering the contemporary resonances of the two words in an entry, or 2, adding a new third term. We're hoping to see everyone have some fun writing short and somewhat experimental pieces of 1,500 to 2,000 words." As the invitation describes, we offered each row of the chart as prompts to our contributors and invited them to explore how the concepts in their respective rows resonate in the historical present, and to interpret the relationship between the terms in their row as they saw fit from their own disciplinary and methodological perspectives. We also gave contributors the option of adding a third term if the original two terms didn't adequately reflect the techno-political present. As you can see, a number of our contributors took us up on our invitation to add a third term. You may have noticed that in the table of contents, there are multiple entries titled White Capitalist Patriarchy, Informatics of Domination. In the chart of transitions, this pairing comprises the final row. This final row can be read as having more weight than the other rows because it contains the informatics of domination. The placement of white, remember that the chart is in a section titled the informatics of domination. The placement of white capitalist patriarchy and informatics of domination together in the final row works against expected modes of reading charts, with organizing concepts typically appearing in the first row or as a superintending title. By contrast, the chart of transitions final row presents an exercise in back reading that destabilizes and upends readers' assumptions about what to expect from the chart and how to read it. For example, readers from Western perspectives might typically expect to read charts from top to bottom and left to right. The chart of transitions refuses these assumptions and refuses a kind of passive reading. Rather, the chart insists that readers engage in what Patricia Reed calls the labor of navigation. That is, an active and agential process of thinking with the chart, of making deliberate and creative decisions about how to move through the chart and how to interpret the relations between rows, columns, and cells. In this context, we can read the final row as simultaneously having the final word, while also inviting a re-encounter with the previous rows, which can be considered anew in light of the structuring role of the pairing white capitalist patriarchy and informatics of domination. In other words, there's a recursive element built into the chart through this final row. To enact this recursive, nonlinear process of reading the chart, we multiplied this final row to 7 different authors and author collectives, and dispersed these 7 entries throughout the collection. We did this to diffuse and refract the pairing of white capitalist patriarchy and informatics domination throughout, rather than allowing it to carry outsized structural weight at the end of the collection. This editorial decision also came about because we couldn't decide on a single author or author collective to write the super important entry. We thought that, given the expansive interdisciplinary range of our collection, having only one author's perspective on this row went against our commitment to bringing multiple perspectives to bear on the informatics of domination. So instead, invited 7 authors to write entries on this row. We also invited contributing authors to play with and experiment with form, to not necessarily be beholden to the norms of the scholarly essay, and we invited all of our authors to engage their terms to both periodize the present, as well as engage in an active world building, so the entries don't just diagnose the present, but inhabit an anticipatory orientation toward possible futures. Other than that, we left it to the authors to decide how they wanted to engage their terms and how they wanted to interpret the relation between their 2 terms. As a result, some entries interrogate the present through the lens of a single term, while other entries chart an epistemic shift between the original 2 terms or examine the dialectical relationship. Other entries introduce a third term that better addresses some aspect of the contemporary moment. Still, other entries use the conceptual tension of their row as an occasion to trace the possible, the dystopic, and the desirable. The resulting contributions include essays on artificial intelligence, on visibility and protest, on transpacific imaginaries, as well as conversations with an AI trained on Black oral histories, a 3-dimensional poetic response to Mexico-US borders, hand-drawn images on queer autotheory, and ecological fictions about gut microbiomes and wet markets. We also invited Donna Haraway to write an afterword, which considers her chart of transitions decades after its original conception. And we commissioned a series of diagrams from Patricia Reed for our epilogue. These diagrams plot and explore various epistemologies of information. All of these additive components reflect our engagement with the chart's theorization of the informatics of domination, as well as our engagement with the chart as a form. I'll talk more about how we analyze the chart form later, but first I want to turn it over to Zach to talk more about the genesis of the project and his perspective as an artist working on this project. Zach.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. Jenny, just since I logged in late, I'm going to switch to sharing my screen, yeah? Okay, great. So, this book originates from a 2017 lecture series that I organized at my previous post when I was a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths University of London. And I was invited to organize the department's public program for the winter term. Um, at the time of receiving an invitation to organize this lecture series, I had taken a really strong interest in what I felt was a surprisingly overlooked concept with the informatics of domination. And I also had this strong interest in wanting to explore this idea with others, particularly as a concept that could enable intersectional feminist thinking and genealogies through engagements with digital media and computation. So the lecture series featured leading scholars engaging such intersectional feminist concerns around digital media, like Simone Brown, who spoke about her work on Blackness and surveillance. But the lecture series also forefronted a number of artists, including Ricardo Dominguez, an artist and professor based at UC San Diego, who shared his digital art projects with his collective electronic disturbance theater that aimed to disturb the Mexico-US border and support undocumented persons attempting to enter the US with a cell phone equipped with GPS software that enabled them to find water sites. There's also artist Heather Dewey Hagborg, an independent artist living in New York, that spoke on her bioart practice that contests emerging modes of genetic surveillance. And also, Taiwanese artist and filmmaker Shili Chang was part of the program. She lives in Paris, and she came over and screened her newest queer sci-fi film at the time, which was Fluid Zero. And in this film, there is a biotech company in the future that's harvesting orgasmic fluids as a kind of new frontier in data mining and extraction, particularly to produce a highly desirable psychoactive drug. And in this film, a community of queer sexual dissidents rise up to resist this kind of biopolitical capture and aim to liberate their sexual pleasures. So, overall, the lecture series was quite successful. And engaging with these other speakers set off a lot of really productive thinking around this idea. And we were subsequently invited by eFlux, which, if those of you aren't familiar with eFlux, this is a popular platform in the contemporary art world for theoretical discourse and inquiry. And eFlux invited myself and other contributors to publish their talks and extrapolations from the series on their platform. So, at first I saw this series right as a kind of experiment. I wanted to see how others would take up and respond to the informatics of domination. Would this concept resonate with them and our audience, or would it come off outdated in the end and not useful to present political conversations? But in the end, it was quite clear that this concept was most productive and very generative. And the result of the series really inspired me to commit to engaging with this concept in more depth, and it motivated me to pursue a second, bigger project around informatics of domination. Now, at the time, I was teaching an undergraduate theoretical seminar at Goldsmiths called Feminist and Queer Technoscience, in which we read Haraway Cyborg Manifesto. And year after year, in this class that was composed of mostly artists, when we studied the Cyborg Manifesto together, these art students would always immediately gravitate toward the chart of transitions. And, in a way, it didn't surprise me because the chart draws attention to the construction of form as part of the production of meaning. And even in Haraway's own language, with describing the informatics of domination, we see aesthetic creative language. So the students' continued interest in this chart led me to think that I think this is the object to organize a second project around. So I immediately reached out to Jenny and Melody to see if they would like to edit a collection with me in which one contributor would take a line from this chart. And we brought many of these, the same people from the Goldsmiths lecture series, but we also brought in new additions. And as we got to work, I was reminded of an earlier artistic reworking of Haraway's chart, perhaps the first, at least the first known to us, which is by one of our contributors, Ricardo Dominguez. His artwork, Virtual Timeline from 1997, which you're looking at, reworks white capitalist patriarchy and the informatics of domination into various stages of capitalism, which you can see at in the top column headings. Again, we find an artist, taking an interest in Haraway's chart. So we address virtual timeline in our introduction. Actually, it's what we start with, given its historical importance. But we also engage with Ricardo's chart because the diagram, as a multiplicitous form that includes charts, we can talk about the chart diagram dyad later if we so desire, is not something that exists solely within scholarship or intellectual thought. The diagram is fundamentally aesthetic, at times experimental. It's a mode of formalization that visualizes and spatializes ideas, arguments, relations, and more. And as such, we also take time to situate Haraway's chart within histories, genealogies, and current practices of diagrammatic art. So in our introduction, we consider the chart of transitions in relation to diagrammatic artworks like Mark Lombardi's work, which he describes as narrative structures that make visible difficult to articulate linkages between people, corporations, and power. Um, and we even look at sculptural three-dimensional artwork, which can be diagrammatic as well, such as this work by American artists that spatializes a particularly Black mode of resistance to contemporary digital surveillance. So in these examples of diagrammatic art I've briefly shown, I would say that these artists are creating, but they're also theorizing. And this becomes a crucial editorial point for the book that I'm quite invested in as an artist. We invited numerous artists to this collection to not only be formally experimental, but also to theorize, because artists also theorize through diagrams, but a multitude of other forms. And thus, I think a takeaway point here, which feels very much in the spirit of Haraway, is that intellectual thought and theorizing are not only limited to scholars and universities, but are also open to artists, which is something that we very much forefront in this book. And now to end my section, I just want to highlight one entry that I think does this very beautifully and provocatively, which is a piece written by the art collective Rahad May. Now, across their entry, they sketch a picture like Haraway does of a contemporary figure at the heart of the informatics of domination, a figure they identify as a worker coded as feminine, caught and entangled in the meshes of platform capitalism and AI capitalism. And this piece, it's a evocative, rich, captivating read. And this is basically what Rahad may have done with this entry is that they visualized another figure for us besides the cyborg living and enduring in the informatics of domination today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melody.
Great. So I'll be talking about two key concepts in the collection, informatics and white capitalist patriarchy. So one thing we began with in the collection is, and I think I might have drafted this line, informatics is a concept that when left to its own devices likes to give the impression that domination is not part of the picture. So as we were thinking about this, of course, we did the OED deep dive into the etymology of informatics, which originates independently from Russian, German, and French approximately in the 60s. And then comes to describe what became computer science departments in English-speaking countries. Now, as part of our archive for understanding like how what this term means, we also looked at the departments that name themselves as such. And some of these examples have actually changed their language on their landing pages since we drafted the introduction about 5 or 6 years ago. So it was interesting for me to see what shifted. And the original definition of informatics had something more to do with simply the study of information processing, full stop. But as I was putting the slides together for this, they began to do something a little bit different, which is include the study of people, or to think about emphasizing people and their relations to different information technologies. And one thing I found interesting about the University of Edinburgh's definition is that it sort of redefines something that was in an earlier formulation, that informatics was the study of sort of artificial devices in relation to natural systems. And so they sort of recapitulate this in the second definition here. And as you can see in my colleagues' department down at UC Irvine, their Department of Informatics also emphasizes people. So where the arrow shows here, informatics studies challenges that arise from the intersection of people, information, and technology. And this tracks actually very closely to something that Anne Catherine Hales in 1999 presciently described or defined, where informatics is the technologies of information as well as the biological, social, linguistic, and cultural changes that initiate, accompany, and complicate their development. So this definition, and of course, like Hales was writing contemporaneously with Haraway, and they were in dialogue on a number of things throughout the years. This definition, 25 years ago, includes people or the sort of the social political component before information or informatics departments sort of reached out to do that. But now we see a sort of turn to addressing that part, but not necessarily the domination part. So one thing that informatics also famously describes in Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto is a very quotable part of her essay. She calls the comfortable old hierarchies and dominations a kind of like system of scary new networks that then is called the Informatics of Domination. And as Zach was pointing out earlier with the form of the chart, one thing I found interesting in the Cyborg Manifesto is how Haraway herself draws on a kind of descriptive language informed by artworks and forms. So she doesn't define informatics of domination really as such. She gives it she uses it to name a section, and then it appears in this paragraph and in the chart of transitions that was talked about earlier. And in the red highlighted areas of this paragraph, she uses words like sketch, picture, frame, chart to describe the emergence of something that then by the end of this paragraph, she finally calls the informatics of domination. Now, as to where we see informatics in the collection, Patricia Reed's final diagram, we've called it an epilogue, is entitled Interpreting Information. And so this is sort of a fun moment to see a more sort of formally experimental chart than what Haraway calls the monological device of the two-column chart, which she has not only in Cyborg Manifesto, but also in multiple other essays. We see it in Modest Witness at Second Millennium. We see it in the essay Universal Vampires in a Donor Culture, among other places. And so here, Reed uses different kinds of images to sort of plan, chart a different sort of genealogy of informatics. Now, my other term, white capitalist patriarchy, this is in part of the dyad at the very bottom of the chart, as Jenny foreshadowed. And one thing we tried to do in the introduction is look at a genealogy of who has put these terms together before. And so some of the important precedents come from Black studies and feminist theory. So bell hooks coined imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, which interjects another adjective in there. We connect it to Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, and also Patricia Hill Collins' phrase matrix of domination, which Collins describes as systems of heteropatriarchy, neocolonialism, capitalism, racism, imperialism that constitute forms of oppression that characterize global geopolitics and take different forms across nation states and catalyze social inequality. And then in a more contemporary period, we can see Ruha Benjamin identifying something she calls the New Jim Code to look at connections between racism and algorithms of oppression. We also focused on another very quotable moment in the Cyborg Manifesto where Haraway, which was cited in some earlier drafts of pieces, which we tried to narrow down, in one moment, Haraway describes communication sciences and modern biologies as both constructed by a common move, the translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears, and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange. Whereas the sort of quick gloss on the Cyborg Manifesto would be to say, oh, Haraway's saying that the world is now a problem of coding. It's periodized as a problem of coding. We wanted to emphasize the clause before, where Haraway says that it's communication sciences and modern biologies that are saying this. And so she's just parroting a common narrative pattern in those discourses. So again, rather than seeing the world as code as a kind of natural thing or periodizing thing that now we all do, Haraway is being a little more critical, stepping back and saying, look at this pattern and what the sciences are saying. And so in the introduction, we also map how this question of code also can be thought differently and even more utopically, or in terms of resistance, especially from Black, queer, and trans perspectives. So Sarah Elwood writes in Thinking Otherwise that much Black, queer, trans, and feminist code study starts with the proposition that in spite of structural conditions aligned to ensure exclusion and death, these subjects are always also surviving and creatively intervening to catalyze possibilities for life and liberation. So again, rather than thinking of code as always that which captures or locks down, how have minoritarian groups also thought through code in terms of resisting structures of oppression? And so we gathered together different examples of this, notably queer handkerchief codes, or Misha Cardenas talking about code poetry in relation to algorithmic analysis, and Zach's project Transcoder Queer Programming Anti-Language from 2008. And so that also maps one tension throughout the essays in the collection, which is between diagnosing questions of domination and capture, and essays or chapters that really try to open up other possibilities. And so we write on page 13 in the introduction, whose worlds by their mere existence attest to the impossibility of computer code as a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange. So with the question of informatics, to go back to that term, we're really trying to think about informatics for whom? For whom is this concept being mobilized into what kind of desires? And as Jenny pointed out, we see white capitalist patriarchy and informatics of domination in multiple essays in the collection. And so as you have a chance to read through, look at it, look for it not just in these highlighted chapters, but I think there's a number of other chapters that also demonstrate a clear connection with white capitalist patriarchy. And a great example of this is Shaka McLaughlin's essay or chapter, The More Things Change, The More Things Change, which also includes a provocative 2-column chart as well. All right, and I'll pause there and turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you. Well, I want to be mindful of time, and so I had a couple more things to say, but I think maybe I'll go through them very, very quickly, and then and do a lot of abbreviation here, and then we can open up the floor for questions. And I'll just say, let me just share my screen. Skipping over some slides, I just wanted to give a shout out to Sam McBean, a feminist and queer theory scholar, who wrote this incredible article about feminist diagrams that we're so excited to find. And we were so excited to discover that McBean was theorizing what they call a feminist diagram in very much the same ways that we were analyzing the chart of transitions, and that is through a commitment to openness and through a kind of commitment to change, right? In mapping power in order to change them. We are in conversation with not just in our introduction, we put the chart of transitions in conversation, not just with artworks that take up diagrams, but also with diagrammatic practices that are aimed towards resistant and liberatory possibilities, like W.E.B. Du Bois's data visualizations that animated a body of African American socioeconomic data to expose racial inequality and segregation, and the algorithmic ecology. It's a method developed by the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and the Free Radicals Collective. The algorithmic ecology offers a method for diagrammatically analyzing contemporary algorithms' broader ecologies of power in order to enact a world without data-driven surveillance and policing. We also, in addition to McLaughlin's experimentation with form that Melody talked about, we also have Jennifer Hamilton and Astrida Nemanis's experimentation with form, and essentially what they did was they created a list, which is a one-column chart, right? That addresses composting climate emergency. And this piece is oriented toward futures that center multi-species in ecological care. Let's see, in terms of maybe one more. I just want to feature a few more contributors that might generate entries that might generate discussion. For example, Jian Chen's entry asserts that indigenous Pacific worlds endure amidst geographies of white, cis, heteropatriarchal imperialism. And one of the things that I'm going to be, that joins all of the essays that I'm going to be briefly kind of featuring here is how they all speak to that element that Melody brought up, that the informatics of domination as a concept and white capitalist patriarchy as a concept are not totalizing, right? And that there are many worlds and ways of knowing, thinking, living, and being that are kind of challenge the totalization of these concepts. And so we have Chen's essay, we have Ashkan Sepavan's poetic narrative that evokes the occult as a mode of being and a force that radically interrupts the temporalities and orderings associated with informatics of domination and white capitalist patriarchy. We have Alma Budge Johnstone's essay, which is a speculative fiction that similarly evokes haunting and ghosts as rupturing normative time and the racialized colonial fantasies that underpin eugenics. And He Hobart's entry, which considers the settler colonial dimensions of cold storage technologies in Hawaii to ask what a Hawaii beyond refrigeration could look like. So those are just some of the entries that really reflect on those modes of knowing and being that challenge precisely the possibility of coding as a kind of totalizing language. Okay, and I'll wrap it up there. And thank you for listening to our remarks.